This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is the, Sunday,
The 24th.
March the 24th, and you're tuned to WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. We are community radio for East Central Illinois. This is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, and everything else that's been going on in the past week, and things that are in fact coming up. I see that there's a prairie plant sale coming up in about, 1 week?
Yes. I don't have the date.
It's
Oh,
actually,
right
I
here.
brought it with you. It's not
the
that,
11th.
or the 5th. Well, I think it's after next Sunday.
Oh, I don't know. The annual plant sale will be May the 11th at 8 to 1 p.m. And there's a spring membership meeting on April the 5th at 7 p.m.
And we may come back and talk about that a little bit later because
Yes.
you were going to talk about the pollinator meeting that we went to. And I have a question for you about buying plants that have already been started versus just buying seed. So maybe we can
Okay.
we can talk about that later.
Yeah. Well, David invited me to a meeting that was part run by the Pheasants Forever, part by Master Naturalists, I think. And it was Jason Leach, who's a Pheasants Forever conservation specialist. And I think there must have been about 100 people there.
Sounds right.
And it was in the Farm Bureau building. And there's a great interest in some of this pollinator stuff at the moment. It happens to be that pollinators can, if you have a set-aside, you can almost make as much money out of a set-aside as you can out of growing corn. So there are people there, people who are sympathetic with the idea that most of our vegetables are pollinated by bees. Traditionally, it would have been by bumblebees, but we introduced Italian bees, and Italian bees are there. There is a little bit of question about whether this will take over all the vacant spots where we have remnant prairies. We asked about that a little bit. But anyway, let me have David give you a comment on that meeting, because I thought it was good. He asked some questions.
Yes. So, yes, I work at the Orpheum Children's Museum, and much of our outdoor courtyard area is set aside for pollinator plants. And every spring and summer, we have monarch butterflies and plenty of bees. From having Michelle Duenas on your show a couple of times, I've learned that bees are not your enemy. They're not going to sting you. In fact, most of the bees that we encounter are boy bees, and they don't have stingers at all, so they can't. You can annoy them, maybe they'll fly in your face, but so I've actually learned to explain to the children not to be afraid of bees, because just leave them alone. So since we have these pollinator plots in the courtyard of the museum, I really wanted to go to this this talk this last week, and in fact, the person who works full-time at the museum, who is responsible, among other things, for the pollinator stuff outside, was also at the meeting with me, so we went to the meeting together. Very, very interesting. It was interesting to see at least one of his slides that showed dead pheasant, all nicely lined up, but they were dead pheasant, driving home the point that when he's reestablishing natural areas, it's sure to have more animals out there, but then the ultimate goal is to have people shoot them, and we didn't actually go into that angle of it. But I mean, I guess if you're making more area for monarch butterflies and bees and things like that too, you learn to coexist with the hunting population out there, I guess.
Yes, well, Pheasants Forever is a hunting body, and for years they've been putting in switchgrass and other grasses. Mm-hmm. Now they're getting more biodiverse, and that attracts more and different creatures, and often other than hunting creatures. The pheasants are actually an import too, like the bees. There are Italian bees. So the difficulty for remnant prairie preservationists is that most of the places where you plant pollinator plots is on vacant lots where there's a little bit of remnant prairie left. And so the two paradigms are slightly different. The pollinator seed includes cultivars, and it includes seed from out of state, and the proportion of seed is oriented to flowering plants, and plants like milkweed that attract monarchs. Monarchs are a sort of an indicator that butterflies generally are losing out. So they're an indicator species. And many of the farmers there had grown up in the era when they spent their childhood removing milkweeds, which are the habitat for the egg larva pupa cycle of the butterfly creature. So we'll have Jason Bleach on the program again sometime soon.
So I want to jump back really briefly to the prairie plant sale that's coming up. One of the things that Jason said in his talk is that he thinks it's much better for you to spread the seed on your area that you're returning back to nature rather than investing in already growing plants. Now, sometimes it may be necessary to do that. For example, I know that over in Urbana, they needed to very quickly get some waterside, pond-side plants going, so they had to actually start from growing plants. What are your thoughts on if people are going to actually start up a new pollinator area? Would you recommend that they buy plants that are already growing from one of these sales, or would you recommend that they just actually get the seed from somewhere?
It depends. If you're going to plant cordgrass, it's going to take 10 years to grow. So to take a clone of cordgrass is very helpful. But yes, many of the more refined or biodiverse species take a long time to grow.
Uh-huh.
And if you grow them from seed, they'll be in competition with deer and rabbits and the like. So sometimes it's even helpful to have plants grow 3 years old before they're planted, so that they have some maturity and might escape.
I saw a list of some of the types of plants. One of them was New Jersey tea. Now, I know from working with you, that can be amazingly difficult to get going. If you wanted to, would it make sense to buy some New Jersey tea and actually plant it, or would it not survive in this area? I mean, I know.
No, it's okay. The difficulty with New Jersey tea is that the seed on it is green and ripe at the same time. And this is a protective mechanism for many native species. So collecting the seed is difficult. It does grow fairly well, but the thing is that to have a harvest plot, you can't harvest this all in one day. You have to pick it carefully, and a lot of the seed is picked by hand. So an acre of seed for a pollinator plot is picking the seed that grows fairly quickly and is rough and tough. The prairie seed the prairie seed may cost $4,000 or $2,000 a pound, and the pollinator seed would be more like $200 a pound. So they're different mix, and the mixes are made to meet the habitat that you have. So if you have a wetland, you get wetland seed. If you have a dry habitat, you might want to have a little blue stem and things like that. There's a ratio between grasses and broadleaves. If you have too many grasses, they deny the broadleaves. If you don't have the grasses provide the fuel matrix. And I think you asked a question like that. Could you leave the grasses out altogether? The answer is no. You need the grasses for the burning, the controlled burning of prairies.
Okay, if we can dwell on that one more second, not maybe going off the deep end here. So, okay, so this gentleman said that he's been experimenting with less and less grasses in his mixes, and the way I think I went to the extreme, and I asked him, why not just have a mix that has no grasses at all? And he said just what you said. If you're going to do a controlled burn, you need to have those grasses on the ground for it to burn. What if somebody lives in an area where you're going to just throw the seeds out there, you're never coming back? Would it make sense then to just have no grasses because you're never going to go back and burn that area?
Oh, you can't never burn a prairie. The prairies have been 10,000 years subject to lightning, subject to Indian burning. They love to be burned. They're adapted to burning. They don't do very well without it.
Okay.
So if you throw out prairie like that, it will die. You have to be able to burn it. That also means you can burn it in an urban setting. You just have to be knowledgeable about how to burn it and not to burn it in a windy day, and to make sure the smoke. Don't do it after spring has got you a lot of green leaves, because that will give you smoke. So burn it in the wintertime. Some of the prairies that we've been visiting lately have just been burned lately in the wintertime.
Okay.
So, yeah. So interesting. The Department of Transportation is encouraging this. Stephanie Dobbs is chair of a group of landscape people, and they're trying to get pollinators throughout the state. And we applaud that. We just want to watch out to see that it doesn't destroy or weaken the remnant prairies that we have. And so we're particularly interested in the corridor between Rantoul and Paxton, because it doesn't look like it has a lot of prairie, but it has intermittent prairie, and it also has the soils and the bacteria. And so we would hope that the pollinator addition would be on the south side or the east side of the road, so it doesn't get into the remnant area. We need the remnants because we need to document what was, and we don't really know, and it would be dynamic, and it still is dynamic. It changes with the years, but we need to keep our eye on what was, and the state has managed to preserve just 0.01% of the remnant prairie of the state, which was 2/3 prairie, and is loudly touted as a prairie state. So it behooves us to not treat prairie like the white rhino, and try to preserve it when it's almost down to nothing. We need to work with it when we at least have some left, and so that's when we get involved with right-of-way beds. But spring has sprung, and one of the first plants that comes to mind in the spring is a skunk cabbage. So the Natural Areas Study Group, which is a docent group that goes to natural areas and knows about them and can transmit that information to other people, school children and people who are interested in preserving sites. So they had a field trip to Forest Glen, which is a southern part of the Vermilion County. You need to know where you're going to get there. You can go out on 150 and follow the Kickapoo Trail along, but eventually you have to get onto the 74 and go east of the Vermilion River and down to Westville, and then you have to go 5 miles east of Westville, and there's a little bend here and there, so you may be uncertain till you get there. And it's a very nice park. It used to have a railroad through it, if I remember rightly. And it has creeks that run into the Vermilion River. And it has visitor facilities around and can handle quite a few people in the summertime especially. So if you're thinking of going to a place, the Forest Glen is an interesting place to go to. The plants that we're looking for in various places, they like seeps. The seep is a very wet, sort of oozy area, not like a stream. It's sort of broad and has a sort of grass population, but in amongst the grasses and the slope of a seep into a creek, the skunk cabbage is there. You have to look for it because it's the ones that I was finding were about 3 inches high and covered with leaves. And if you stomp around too much, you might just stomp on them. They just look like a little cabbage with a sort of spade shaped leaf behind, and they've got little spots of maroon and brown and green mixed together, and it's kind of fun to see a rather rare plant. And it's you get to it by going to a part of the Forest Glen, and you need a little map. There's a Gertz visitor center there, and in summer that's open and available. And this plant is named appropriately because the leaves, when you scratch them or break them, smell just like a skunk smells when it's been aggravated, and it's a defense mechanism. And it depends on how you regard skunk smells, but most humans are not awfully excited about skunk smells. So it's a skunk cabbage, and it's rare, and it's fun to see it as the first harbinger of spring. Nothing much else come up. I was looking for hepatica, which is another early plant that comes in the spring. I took some photographs of the plant, the habitat, the nearby stream, which was running fairly freely because the snow and accumulated moisture over winter is running out into the Vermilion, just the same way as it's doing in Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And so it was not running a banker, but it was little waterfalls and trickles there. And so we might give you a chance to hear some of that when we put pictures in. While I was there, I visited a little camp that was a sort of heritage camp with a house and a barn, and in amongst that there was maple syrup being collected. There's the maple syrup tree is tapped and allowed to run into a blue bag that is for the purpose. But you can also use a 5-gallon drum and collect it the same way. And that syrup is boiled down till it is a syrup, and it has a healthy flavor because it has other things in it, and it's a fun experience to go to a maple syrup day, and there are several around in different places. I was pleased to see that. Then I visited the Doris Westfall Prairie. Doris Westfall was a citizen in the Danville area, and she took it on her soul to gather up seed and plant a very diverse prairie. It has the basic grasses, but it has a lot of other species. And it's quite a few acres, I would guess perhaps 10 or so acres. And in part of it, there is a pond, and that pond was loaded with frogs, and they were making such a cacophony of sound. And I'm not a frog expert, but I'm sure that a reptile person could sort out what the frogs were about.
You mean an amphibian person? Frogs are amphibians, not reptiles.
Yes.
So herpetology person will cover both.
Gotcha.
This,
Thank you.
I've actually used my 10 weeks of class learning about nature. There you go.
Okay. So there is a tower there that you can climb up to look down on the prairie. The prairie part of it has been burned recently. I was interested to see that it didn't burn totally. We tried to teach people not to burn totally because there are species that don't like burning as much as others, and so you leave little places where they might be able to survive. But basically they did, I think, about half of the prairie. But you get to see this pattern by climbing up into that tower, and that's very helpful. I was very aware that a lot of Doris Westfall's seed came from a unique, about 2 mile long prairie just west of Oakwood. It's destined to be a Kickapoo rail trail. It hasn't come to that phase yet, but it will be a disaster if that trail goes through that prairie. It's a remnant prairie. There is a railroad ballast, but the railroad has been gone for 20 years, and the prairie has grown over the railroad. There's a modest mixture of grasses, but there's a lot of broadleaves. There's a little village next door called Bronson, and the supervisor has changed recently, and he believes in mowing this corridor, which is very traditional, and it's not necessary. We're trying to convince the Department of Transportation, and they're very much aware that the old tradition of starting to mow the roadsides in August the 1st is very mean as far as prairie is concerned, because many of the plants haven't even started to bloom by then. So mowing in the fall is more likely to be helpful in December or late November, which is a little on the problem side because some of the summer employment you have is released at the end of the summer season. So when the visitor centers close, and then you don't have that person power, and a lot of the people who are mowing are farmers, and they don't have a lot to do at that time of the year. So there's quite a bit of debate. Also, the mowing is often much wider than it needs to be. So I went to Oakwood, and through the town, it looks to me like the trail is going to be wiggly-woggly, that it doesn't go straight. So that's a phase of the 25 miles that's in action at the present time. I'm interested in what we can do to preserve that 2 miles. And if you're going to have the permission to make the trail wind and do interesting things, then I think we have the permission to put traffic on a shared road which is adjacent, so that from coming through from Muncie, you would come to the Hickscast, turn off to Bronson, and then parallel on the road. And so I'm suggesting that be the case, and that if it is a trail, that it be a narrow one, not one that is really wide. That means that they can't cap the creosote that's there. That means you have to balance between the well health of, do we cap the cover up, that is, what might be left of creosote from the ties, and the ties are years and years old, so there's not much there. So some places these trails are narrow. Some places they're made to go in one direction only, just because that means you don't have it wide enough for a bicycle to pass or 2 people to walk. So a narrow trail is, I think, available. I've been checking with the Surface Transportation Board that controls the Rail Banking Act, which funds a lot of this trail. They're very popular. The recreation is there, but also we need to be careful about what we do. Do we want to really be responsible for taking out a large section of our only remaining prairie? So yes, that was. I also took photographs of the sort of thing so that other people can understand what we're talking about. On Saturday, I went to a meeting of the the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. This is where we're working with railroad engineers who have one foot in the Railroad Museum, but we would like to have railroads get the chance to come into Champaign. So there's a need to be working cooperatively with the Railroad Museum, but the CH&W is named after one of the early railroads. These railroads went in and out of bankruptcy or ownership. And at one stage, the local people owned a lot of this bed, and it included the Pyatt family from Pyatt County, and Dystrons, and the names in Pyatt County were on the ownership of the railroad at one stage. So Tom Scott, who is from a family of people who settled in Elliott, which is up near Paxton, and they have gradually been heavily involved in the Railroad Museum, and this is an opportunity. We bought the 4 miles between Whiteheath and Seymour for the prairie that's on it, and they have an easement from us, and I'm on their board because we need to make sure that the prairie on either side stays, and they have a 25-foot easement, and we are starting, and mainly the Scott family is big in this effort, and it's happening so slowly. You have to borrow, beg, or steal railroad steel, so they have already about 200 feet of that, and we need ties. So we had some debate about ties. Can you, in the absence of having a large volume of trees, do you use wood? Do you use concrete? or do you even use plastic? Could we work with the universities, respected railroad researchers to try different ties? Well, the answer is that probably not, because what you're doing with research is researching the quality of ties, and you need to have the trains moving over them constantly to test. So putting the ties in is not on a recreational historic railroad is not going to test any tie. On the other hand, it might be an opportunity to test the possibility of taking plastic and fly ash and a mixture of materials, and more or less having a truck that would form tie in situ. So the experiment might be how to put down a series of ties. The thing is that you don't put down a concrete tie next to a steel tie next to a wooden tie. You make the one type so that you can handle it. And the plastic ties have been using fly ash, and we had Trudy Waltran on here as a ceramic engineering person who specializes in some of these things, so that ties are getting to be the formulated ties that are put in place, do it at a lower temperature and without quite so much environmental problem, and the talent would be to put them down in sequence. You need about 2,000 ties per mile. The heavier you get, the more ties you need, and the closer they be, because if you're going to bring a steam engine into town, the weight on each drive wheel is much more than you would have if you brought a diesel train in, where there's a number of different wheels and it spreads the weight. So we're looking for a bridge from the Pennsy Railroad between Oakland and Decatur through Hinesboro, Arcola, and Arthur. That line was acquired by the Department of Natural Resources for a trail, but it was not contiguous, so 11 sites had been sold, and they couldn't be bought back easily, so that rail bed is now going back to farmers. But once again, it's difficult because that railroad bed was, in some places especially, was loaded with native prairie that we'll never get again. So we talked about those sorts of things. How do you encourage this? How do you let people know what we're doing? How do we communicate? Over and over, it's a matter of balancing between having volunteers to work and actually put in rail, and having a communication with various agencies involved, like the Railroad Museum and the CHNW. There's a lot of work there. There are titles, there are deeds, and there are legal things. So how do you do that? You can get the idea to start with, and then you have to have a formal constitution, which lets you know how to do this more formally. But a lot of these things start off from the seat of the pants. We have, I should mention that re-railing to Seymour is only part of the act. There's another abandonment from Seymour to Bonneville to Staley, and that's about 7 miles long. and the rails are there at the moment. And you don't have to put the rails in, you don't have to put all the ties in, and we would love to buy that. It might cost us in the vicinity of $1 million to buy that bed, but it saves the railroads from taking out. Or could we get the two elevators that are on that line to combine and take their grain out by train? They've stopped doing that because the main lines don't really want to have small packets of 10 or 12 cars. They're looking for more like 125 cars or 200 cars. And so you would have to have an agreement that was part historic, part getting grain out. And the grain on the rails is so much more kind to the infrastructure. If you have to put all that grain on a vehicle and have it run the roads, you're costing the taxpayer a lot of money for reconstitution of those roads every so often. And it's perfectly obvious that the weight of a semi-trailer is much more difficult on a highway than a car or what have you. So there's the interaction there of two different elevators servicing two different populations. You have to know where the grain is going to go, where it's going to be weighed, and how do we have to have our own engine to put the small cars out onto the main line so that Canadian National can pick them up without having to take an expensive couple of engines out there to pick up a few cars. It's not labor and efficient to do that. So that's why the small elevators get closed out. But we would be wanting them to come back in, so we do teach about elevatoring as well as activating those small communities when you put in a trail. And this re-rail, while it's happening, which might take years, is that it could be an interim rail trail, so that people could use it. And adjacent, there is an interurban railroad bed, which we in the long run would like to buy, so that when we are fully railroaded, we can have a hike and bike trail next door, so we won't be destroying the concept of a rail trail on the main line. Yeah, interesting activities, and one of the problems we have is that there's always been an easement for electricity, and the towers are steel, and they're into the ground, and they're carrying quite a lot of electricity, 5 or so lines, and these towers are now in mid-20s, so they're about 90 years old, and they're being replaced by poles. And so I had to meet up with Ameren engineers the other day, and male and female, and there's a concern that we may have trees that would short to the line. So we have been talking to Ameren. It's one of those sites that you might want to put pollinator crops on, or save as a prairie. So we're talking, and one of the big problems is that as you've gotten more mature, herbicides have come into action. So there's been blanket herbiciding. So we've lost some of our prairie that we bought the bed for blanket herbiciding, and it's with glycosates, which is Roundup. Roundup is getting some federal criticism because it's there are suits saying that this is a cancerous material. The power companies have backed off a little bit. Instead of blanket spraying, they do like we do with Teasel at Rantoul. We spot herbicide, and that's helpful. And we would encourage things like chainsaws. And I find that there is a helicopter chainsaw. I didn't realize this, but when they have trees that might short, and this has been a question out in the West because it's felt that shorting has actually created some fires that have been big dimensions. So with a helicopter, they can drop a saw down and saw a tree down and make sure that the line is free of shorting. And when the lines are old and you're putting a lot of electricity through them, they get hot and they bend, and so they can bend down. As far as that we're concerned, we would like to take those corridors. They're usually 37 feet wide or narrow, as compared with about 100 feet wide for the main line, usually adjacent to the main line. We'd like to be able to use the remnant prairies on those places. If there's herbicide, then we might not have good prairies, but if the trees have been removed by mechanical means, then we do have that remnant prairie. And surprisingly, some of the prairie plants actually survive the herbicide and give them a year or two, and they come back out. Spiderwood is one that I see all the time that has survived herbicide. So we discussed this. We discussed whether we should mow the whole railroad bed or just the places where the towers are. So it comes down to, yes, we can just mow the working area and not herbicide it, please. And so we're hoping that there's a little bit less herbicide. It happens around the world. It's very easy to spray, but it's also not too hard to spot herbicide. It means you have to have someone with a skidster or a pack on his back to do the spot herbiciding. It's a different cat, but we should be able to afford that. And we're asking at the same time if we can perhaps do that on the way to Danville, the Kickapoo Trail, because there's an interurban that's right up parallel, and it brought electricity to these communities. There's a history there, and we wonder how you work with the power companies and with some sociological understanding of each other's history. I am aware that I was in Monticello, and we have 4 miles of railroad bed there. I'm sort of afraid that if we allow a trail to go through, it will be a trail as wide as the Kickapoo Trail. It will take out all the prairie. So prairie being down to a very little, I'm sort of very positively oriented to not eliminating it with a trail. If the trail people know what they're doing and have an education to understand what their heritage is, then that's okay. But we're not at that stage yet. So this is not necessarily saying no to trail, but you have to also realize that when you have a prairie, you have tall plants, and if you are going to have a trail, you'll have compass plant or dock falling over the trail, and it'll be a mess. So you also have to budget for maintenance to keep that trail open. And at the moment, I'm thinking that these two, after 30 years, these two edges of prairie on either side of the ballast have come together. The prairie is on the ballast. In actual fact, the ballast is a dry area, so you get some of the drier plants. The drains on either side are wet, so we get the frogs and the amphibians that we were talking about before. And this is, I think at the moment, it's better left without a trail, unless we know very well what is happening with the trail and the understanding of its maintenance and its interpretation. It looks like just weeds. So I was out there taking photographs. In some cases, we've had an endangered rattlesnake there that is very mild-mannered, but we found one dead one, but we haven't really found live ones. There are live ones in other parts of Allerton, and they have been there natively over the years. And so with the help of Fran Hardy and the University of Illinois that owns the Allerton Park Farm that's adjacent, the university has provided 66 feet by a mile, and then more recently some more to encourage the habitat at least. And one of these days we may be lucky enough to find an endangered eastern Massasoit rattler. They've taken down the old elevator. It burned and took out an icon that we had hoped to save. But the homestead area that is around that elevator has been somewhat demolished for farming purposes that support the Allerton Park that is visited and is so popular. So I photographed the litter that's there. It's accumulating litter at a fairly fast pace. It could do with a burn at the moment. There's been some attempts to burn it before, but you have to be worried that if you burn it in the spring right now, the rattlesnakes are coming out of their hibernation. And you have to know something about how they hibernate. They sometimes get together in crawdad holes and overwinter. So if you burn too late, you're going to burn your snake. Mm-hmm. So there has been an occasion where we were burning this. The Department of Natural Resources was burning purposely, and then had to stop because if we burn too late, then we'll lose what we're cherished in the first place. I took photographs of that, and I took photographs of the counterpart rail bed area. The 66 feet by a mile is a reconstruction prairie with about 12 3-year-old species and a light planting of grasses so that they don't dominate the neighbor trail that Heartland Pathways owns, or the neighboring corridor, not a trail, is much different. It's mature. The prairie on either side is growing well, and we do have some problems. One, it has to be labeled as such. Two, it has to be mown carefully. The directive that has been recently to mow down to the ditch, but then comes fall and it's mown up the ditch on the railroad side. And so I was taking photographs of the remains of prairie that was taken out in the fall by fairly extensive mowing. it's probably 30 feet from the road to the prairie. And we have to think about doing less of that, and there's not only mowing, but there's also invasive species. At Rantoul we have teasel because of the cemetery, because teasel is a fine dried arrangement in wreaths, and so. But elsewhere we also have an autumn olive, which was brought in by conservation department people, and not quarantined for long enough to know what it was going to do. It was thought that it had olives on it, good food for birds, and sure enough, it's good food for birds, and the birds chase it around and they defecate somewhere else, and then you have another tree there. So the whole region of east central Illinois and in various states, autumn olive trees. They're not the hugest trees, but they're enough to worry the power companies that they might short the lines, and that can lead to massive mowing or herbiciding. So we need to be with people out there with saws, with spot herbiciding to eliminate those trees. If we leave them go because we don't have the money to do it or the volunteers, that will be difficult. It can even change the pH or the acidity of the soil. So we have to be worried about that. This week, I think I got time to say something. Art Tucker has been with me, and he's been introducing me to how to put things on Facebook, and it's been quite remarkable. I started off with a large document, and it's meaningful because it documents some of the things we've been doing, and so that is okay. But that's not for Facebook or Twitter. So we took the skunk cabbage, and we made a little bit of line around it, just enough to satisfy Facebook and enough to satisfy Twitter. And it was amazing, the feedback. We have stored up about 500 Facebook friends, and so they were calling back and saying they like, and it's been fun to do that. We have to be more public. We have to talk to young people, because it's perfectly obvious that the young people are not going to have the resources that their great-grandfathers had, or great-grandmothers. The open space and the pollinators and the monarchs and the creatures we're talking about are getting less and less. And there's some creatures that, on the other hand, take over. So we have our little plot. We've lost our pocket prairie, but in that you could have an occiput that would take a dove right in town. So sometimes the creatures that you think are very wildlife and out there in the boondocks manage to survive in downtown. You'll see raccoons, and you'll see cougar, different dogs and others. Even wolves will take over, and then they get to be exterminated because they're not part of the ecosystem, but they really are. So we've been looking at that, and then let's remind you that when you do this, we would like some times to get financial help for this, but you have to also remember that we've been lucky enough to work with WEFT, and coming up soon there'll be a WEFT drive, and so we have a fun drive, and it behooves us to make sure that WEFT stays on the air. I have to remind you that the annual native plant sale is on May the 11th. It's important that you get there early because it's very popular and the plants are limited. And if you want a biodiverse little plot of prairie in your front yard, you should be there early. They're around about $3 a pot, or if they're older or 3 years old or special rare plants, you might be charged a little more. If they're big plants, you might be paying more. The 11th of May, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. And also remember that there's a spring membership meeting, and that's on a Friday night, April the 5th, and it's usually at the Farm Bureau. Let me see where we are here. I think that's out there by Country Fair, and it will be 3 ecologists, and
you've got 30 seconds.
There's exploring various aspects of the cultural native landscape. That is on April the 5th at 7 p.m. and I'm saying it's at the Farm Bureau facility on Country Fair Drive. And there's a native plant sale on Saturday, May the 11th. And it's only in the morning, so don't arrive there late.
It's noon. You should tell them who you are.
So this is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WA3 Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.